one of the things in life that seems to bring people joy is hobbies. Do you have any hobbies? I worry sometimes about myself that I don't have many hobbies. Really, maybe not any. Someday, I'm going to be a has-been if I'm not already nearly there. And someday when no one wants to pay me for anything I do, I've often wondered, what will I do to be fulfilled? I don't have many hobbies. You see, I see friends out there whose lives are just wrapped up in their hobbies, perhaps following a particular sports team, or sitting in a deer stand, or playing golf, or collecting things, or doing crafts, and I'm a little envious. Now don't get me wrong, it isn't that I don't have interests. I love music, and I love theater, and I love history, particularly about presidents. I've often thought if I had more disposable income and any kind of talent for fixing things, I would collect antiques, furniture maybe, or if I had even more income, maybe cars, antique cars. I'm drawn to things of the past. I'm the one who at the museum wants to stop and read every exhibit, while Jean has breezed her way through and is sitting at the snack bar wondering when I'm ever going to be done. Our scripture this morning is from the Old Testament, and in some ways it's kind of an antique message. Joshua is the preacher, and the sermon topic is loyalty. A rather quaint but antique sort of concept. The Oxford English Dictionary defines loyalty as true to obligations of duty and law. Now, Joshua is a leader who knows his people. He knows the good, the bad, and the ugly about them. He knows what they are capable of. They can choose, if they will, to demonstrate incredible courage and firm resolve in the face of overwhelming pressures to give up. They can choose, if they so will, to overcome mind-blowing obstacles and live by faith that can move mountains. For after all, this is the people that walked across a Red Sea and a River Jordan to defeat enemy armies who outnumbered them 100 to 1. Joshua knows what they can do while trusting in a God whose loyalty to them never wavers. But Joshua also knows that his people can be fickle and whiny and weak. He knows how easy it is for them to go with the latest trend or fad or fashion. For you see, if the gods of the Amorites or the Perizzites or the Hittites are promising a more impressive spiritual package or program with less sacrifice, well then that's where they will head. If the religion of the surrounding and prevailing culture seems to offer a quicker profit or a more entertaining message or more convenient way to worship and serve, well, who can blame them for going with the crowds? It's hard to swim against the tide. Maybe that's why John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, said in a sermon on this passage, he said, "They that are bound for heaven must be willing to swim against the stream, and must do not as most do, but as the best do." Did you get that? Not do as most do, but as the best do. Loyalty is an ancient, maybe even eternal concept that is being swept away by the strong headwinds of our times. Till death do us part. Death? Is that really possible? In this time and age when even a $10 million wedding can't make a marriage last longer than 72 days. Remember the Kardashians? Now I know there are reasons that marriages end, And we live as an imperfect people in an imperfect world, which means we have imperfect relationships. And the last thing those who've lived through the heartbreak of divorce need is to have a bunch of guilt heaped upon them. But there's a big difference between a marriage that ends after extraordinary attempts to make it last have been tried and failed, and those who give up in days. Because guess what? This marriage business sometimes is what? Hard. Loyalty is not a concept for sissies. Loyalty can be hard. It can take mental and physical and spiritual muscle to remain loyal. Swimming against the tide takes strength and patience and perseverance. And Joshua knew that, and he knew that his people could easily be swept along into changing alliances and allegiance. He builds the case for loyalty by recounting for them all that the God of Israel had done for them, all the ways God had remained faithful to them and been there for them and pulled their corporate assets out of a sling time and time again. It just seems a part of our nature to quickly forget what others have done for us, while for decades we can remember what they've done to us, can't we? Am I correct in my perception that loyalty has been on a downward slide now for several decades in our culture? And the last generation who seemed to do loyalty pretty well was the generation that the broadcaster Tom Brokaw called the greatest generation. One of the true joys and blessings of my life has been to interact with so many folks from that generation, my grandparents' generation. As I entered the ministry some 29 years ago, it was the greatest generation folks who were the leaders in the church. This is the generation whose lives have been shaped and weathered by a Great Depression and 2 world wars. They were not and are not a perfect people, but they knew how to do loyalty. We all could give countless illustrations of how that loyalty was displayed in their lives. I think about somebody like Mr. Frank Brown, one of the saints of Toxaway United Methodist Church, where I had the privilege to serve for 20 years. Frank was married until death departed him from his wife after 40-some years. He worked for the same employer about as long. He was a lifelong Methodist, 50 years of that time a member at Toxaway Church. He was a lifelong Democrat. He said he'd never forget what Franklin Roosevelt had done for his country and his family. When I came to Toxaway in 1994, Frank drove a 1976 Chrysler Newport. Have you ever seen one? It's about the size of a Titanic. Yep. He had bought it new, but on some days he still drove his 1964 Plymouth Valiant, which he also had bought new. I don't know for how many years, but for several years, Frank ate every lunch and every supper at Bojangles on Clemson Boulevard. He would be so sad that that restaurant closed. In fact, at his funeral, several of the employees came. I don't think it's because Frank was addicted to chicken. I think it was because he became loyal to the folks at that restaurant. I could set my clock on Sunday mornings, but by the time Mr. Frank arrived to do his job in the church as the Sunday school superintendent, and in fact one Sunday when he did not arrive at 9:50 a.m. on the nose, I became concerned, and then the telephone rang. I soon learned that he'd had a car accident on East Whitmer Street. A taxi cab had pulled out in front of him in his 1976 Chrysler Newport, and believe me, you don't want to pull out in front of a 1976 Chrysler Newport. So I went up the street to check on him. His car was not drivable. I said, "Frank, do you want me to take you home?" I knew he'd been rattled by the experience. He said, No, I'll go on to church. Because you see, that's what you do when you are loyal. Joshua builds his case for loyalty by pledging not only his own commitment, but the commitment of his entire household to serve the Lord. Now, in our culture, where individual choice and individual rights are seen as supreme, it may be offensive to some that Joshua would speak for his wife and children. Have you ever done that, husbands? Get you in trouble, huh? Shouldn't they be able to choose for themselves? In our culture, it seems that when it comes to decisions about spiritual affiliations, many times we're actually letting the children choose for the family. We often hear, well, we're going over here because that's what the children want to do. We want to keep the children interested. Somehow the notion of loving children and letting children be in charge, I think, has gotten sort of confused. God calls us to love our children with all of our hearts, and in that loving we have